A truck breaks down on a desert road, 500 miles from anywhere. The driver, sweating through his shirt, climbs out to inspect the engine while his passengers wait in silence. 23 men, women, and children packed into a cargo bed designed for freight, not humans. They've been traveling for 6 days through terrain that could kill them faster than bullets. No one speaks. They learned weeks ago that words waste water, and water is the difference between reaching the coast and becoming another pile of bones, bleached white by the Saharan sun. What they don't know is that 15 miles ahead, hidden beneath the facade of a beachside diving resort, Israeli intelligence operatives are tracking their position through encrypted radio signals, waiting for nightfall to extract them from a country that would execute everyone involved if the truth ever surfaced. Subscribe now to never miss stories like this about Mossad's most daring operations. This is Sudan, 1984, a nation ravaged by civil war, famine, and ideological violence. The government in Khartoum belongs to the Arab League, sworn enemies of Israel, who sent troops to destroy the Jewish state in 3 consecutive wars. Sudan's borders are death traps for anyone fleeing persecution. Yet thousands are trying anyway, walking barefoot through killing heat, because staying means certain destruction. They are Ethiopian Jews, descendants of an ancient community that practiced Judaism for millennia in isolation from the rest of the Jewish world. Beta Israel, they call themselves, the House of Israel. And Israel is coming for them, one clandestine extraction at a time, through one of the most audacious deceptions in intelligence history. The resort is called Arus Village. It sits on a pristine stretch of Red Sea coastline, where turquoise water meets white sand, the kind of location travel magazines dream about. Guests fly in from Europe seeking adventure, diving expeditions, and exotic escapes from corporate monotony. They sip cocktails under palm trees, while instructors prepare scuba gear. The staff speaks multiple languages, the facilities rival anything in the Mediterranean, and the management seems refreshingly competent for such a remote location. Everything appears normal, meticulously normal, because that's exactly what Mossad designed it to be. A functioning tourist destination that generates real revenue, attracts real guests, and provides perfect cover for operations happening in the darkness beyond the perimeter lights. The operation began 2 years earlier, when Israeli intelligence confirmed what humanitarian organizations had been reporting for months. Ethiopian Jews were dying in refugee camps across Sudan, fleeing war and starvation in their homeland, only to face disease and despair in a country that offered no refuge. Israel faced a strategic and moral crisis. Thousands of Jews trapped in enemy territory with no legal pathway to safety. Diplomatic channels were impossible. Sudan's government would never cooperate with Israel. Military intervention risked regional war. Traditional refugee resettlement required years of bureaucratic approval that these people didn't have. So Mossad proposed something unprecedented. Establish a covert base inside Sudan, maintain it for years if necessary, and extract refugees through a network so invisible that even the local population would never suspect its existence. The plan required infrastructure, not just operatives and equipment, but a reason to be there that would withstand scrutiny from Sudanese intelligence services, local authorities, and anyone else who might grow suspicious of foreigners operating near a sensitive coastline. A diving resort offered the perfect solution. Tourism was one of Sudan's few growth industries, despite the chaos engulfing the interior. The Red Sea coastline remained relatively secure, and foreign investment in hospitality was encouraged by officials eager for hard currency. A Swiss-European consortium expressing interest in developing a remote beach property would attract approval, not suspicion, especially if that consortium brought capital, created jobs, and paid taxes without causing trouble. Gad Shimron was chosen to lead the ground operation. Tall, athletic, fluent in Arabic and English, he possessed the rare combination of technical skill and psychological flexibility required for long-term deep cover assignments. His official identity was that of a European entrepreneur investing in African tourism. His real mission was to build and operate a functioning resort while coordinating the rescue of thousands of refugees under conditions where a single mistake would result in execution. He arrived in Sudan in early 1982 with a team of operatives posing as diving instructors, hotel managers, and maintenance staff. Their cover identities were supported by meticulously forged documentation, business licenses, employment histories, financial records, every detail cross-referenced and verifiable. They weren't pretending to run a resort, they were actually running one, because the best lies are built on foundations of truth. The location they selected was an abandoned tourist facility that had failed under previous management. The property offered strategic advantages, isolated enough to prevent casual observation, close enough to refugee routes for nighttime extractions, and equipped with basic infrastructure that could be renovated without raising questions about unusual construction. They negotiated a lease with local authorities, emphasizing their commitment to bringing jobs and investment to the region. Sudanese officials were delighted. Foreign investors willing to develop remote properties were rare, and these Europeans seemed refreshingly serious about their venture. Permits were approved, work began, and within months, Arouse Village opened for business. The resort's public face was impeccable, bungalows repaired and furnished to European standards, a restaurant serving international cuisine alongside local dishes, a dive shop stocked with professional equipment and staffed by instructors certified through legitimate European agencies. Marketing materials circulated through travel networks in Switzerland, Germany, and France, targeting adventure tourists seeking undiscovered destinations. The prices were competitive, the facilities genuine, and the experience memorable enough that guests returned home posting enthusiastic reviews that strengthened the operation's credibility. This wasn't a fake resort pretending to host tourists. It was a real resort hosting actual tourists, while concealing a parallel operation that happened in the hours between midnight and dawn, when guests slept and the real work began. Local employees were hired to handle day-to-day operations: cleaning staff, kitchen workers, maintenance crews. They believed they were working for a legitimate European business because that's exactly what it appeared to be. Their paychecks cleared. Their managers treated them professionally. The resort followed Sudanese labor laws and paid local taxes. Nothing in their daily experience suggested anything beyond standard hospitality operations. This was crucial. The operation's security depended on maintaining absolute normalcy in every visible detail. Sudanese intelligence services monitored foreign businesses, looking for patterns that indicated espionage or subversion. Arouse Village had to pass scrutiny, not just casually, but under sustained observation. Every transaction, every shipment, every employee interaction needed to align perfectly with the profile of a legitimate tourist operation. The Mossad operatives maintained their covers with obsessive discipline. They learned the diving business not as a pretense, but as professionals. They studied marine biology, safety protocols, equipment maintenance, and customer service. When guests arrived, they received genuine instruction and authentic experiences. The Israelis couldn't afford to be exposed as amateurs pretending to know diving. Their credibility depended on actually being competent instructors who happened to have a second, secret purpose. This depth of cover required months of preparation before the operation even began. Operatives underwent training in hospitality management, scuba instruction, and the cultural nuances of working in Sudan. They learned to navigate local bureaucracy, cultivate relationships with officials, and blend into expatriate social circles without standing out. Behind the public facade, the resort concealed infrastructure designed for a very different purpose. The dive equipment storage room contained hidden compartments housing encrypted radios that maintained constant contact with Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv. The resort's generator building included a secondary power system that could operate independently, ensuring communications remained active even during local blackouts. One of the bungalows furthest from guest areas served as a secure planning room where operatives mapped extraction routes, analyzed intelligence updates, and coordinated logistics for operations that would unfold hundreds of miles inland. The property's boat dock, ostensibly for diving excursions, provided access to Israeli Navy vessels that waited in international waters beyond the 12-mile limit. The extraction operations followed a carefully choreographed protocol developed over months of reconnaissance and rehearsal. Intelligence networks inside Ethiopia identified groups of refugees attempting the journey to Sudan. Contacts within refugee camps reported when new arrivals had reached relative safety and were ready for the next phase. Coded messages passed through intermediaries, established contact with those willing to risk the final leg toward the coast. On designated nights, when guest activity at the resort was minimal, operatives would depart in vehicles under the pretense of supply runs or personal travel. They drove inland through darkness, navigating desert tracks that erased evidence of their passage. The meeting points changed constantly, rotating through coordinates that existed only as numbers scribbled on paper and burned immediately after memorization. Refugees were instructed to gather in groups no larger than 30, small enough to move quickly, but large enough to justify the logistics of extraction. They waited in predetermined locations, hidden ravines or abandoned structures, where exposure to patrols was minimal. The Mossad operatives arrived in Toyota trucks, purchased through legitimate channels and registered to the resort. If stopped, they carried paperwork explaining supply runs to Port Sudan, or equipment deliveries to coastal installations. The cargo beds were modified with hidden compartments beneath false floors, where refugees could conceal themselves if checkpoint inspections became too thorough. The journey from inland camps to the coast covered distances exceeding 300 miles through terrain that oscillated between punishing extremes. Desert heat during the day reached levels that could kill within hours without adequate water. Night temperatures dropped so severely that hypothermia became a genuine risk for refugees, wearing thin clothing designed for Ethiopian highlands, not Sudanese desert. The operatives carried medical supplies, water rations, and basic provisions, but resources were always insufficient for the numbers attempting the journey. Children cried from thirst until their voices gave out. Adults rationed their water to the point of delirium, knowing that survival required reaching the coast before supplies ran dry. The Israelis pushed the trucks as hard as mechanical limits allowed, racing against dawn when visibility would expose their movements to observation. Breakdowns were inevitable. Vehicles designed for tourism weren't built for the punishment of off-road desert navigation under full loads. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, tires shredded on volcanic rock fields that stretched for miles. When breakdowns occurred far from the resort, operatives faced impossible calculations. Abandon the vehicle and risk leaving evidence that could be traced back to a Rus village? Wait for repair and gamble that daylight wouldn't expose them to patrols? Transfer refugees to remaining trucks, overloading them beyond safe capacity and risking multiple failures. There were no good answers, only choices weighted with varying degrees of catastrophic risk. On several occasions, operatives jury-rigged repairs using materials scavenged from the surrounding desert, wire from abandoned fences, metal strips from discarded containers, improvised tools fashioned from rocks and determination. The refugees themselves became part of the operational security challenge. Most had never seen the ocean. Many spoke only Amharic or Tigrinya, languages none of the European tourists would recognize, but which could still draw unwanted attention if overheard by Sudanese staff or visiting officials. They were instructed to remain absolutely silent during transport, a directive that became torture when cramped in hidden compartments for hours with minimal ventilation. Mothers held hands over children's mouths to suppress coughs. Adults bit down on cloth to muffle groans of pain from injuries sustained during their journey through Ethiopia. The psychological toll of enforced silence under life-threatening conditions was immense, but the alternative was exposure that would result in immediate arrest and likely execution for everyone involved. Arriving at Erus village required timing calibrated to the rhythms of resort operations. Trucks couldn't approach during hours when guests might be awake or when local staff were present. The window typically opened between 2 and 4 in the morning, after the last guest had retired, and before kitchen workers arrived to begin breakfast preparations. The vehicles entered through a service road that bypassed the main resort entrance, parking behind the generator building where they were shielded from casual observation. Refugees were moved quickly into a storage facility, ostensibly used for dive equipment maintenance. The space had been modified to provide temporary shelter, sleeping mats on the floor, water supplies, basic food. They would remain hidden there for hours or sometimes days, waiting for conditions to align for the final phase of extraction. The naval phase represented the operation's most vulnerable moment. Transferring dozens of people from shore to boats required coordination with Israeli Navy vessels waiting beyond territorial waters. These ships maintained positions just outside the 12-mile limit, close enough to respond quickly, but distant enough to maintain plausible deniability if detected by Sudanese coastal patrols. Communication was maintained through encrypted burst transmissions sent from the resort's hidden radio equipment. Messages were compressed into microsecond pulses that sounded like static interference on monitoring equipment, making interception difficult and decryption virtually impossible without Israeli cryptographic keys. The transmissions confirmed refugee numbers, weather conditions, and timing for pickup operations. On extraction nights, Operatives used Zodiac inflatable boats, ostensibly belonging to the resort's diving operation. These vessels were powerful enough to reach international waters quickly, while maintaining a low profile that wouldn't attract attention from shore. The refugees were loaded after midnight, when darkness provided maximum concealment. They wore life jackets distributed by the operatives, many experiencing their first time on water and fighting panic as the boats accelerated through waves that seemed mountainous to people who had lived their entire lives at altitude. The journey to the waiting ships took approximately 40 minutes, crossing a boundary that transformed them legally from refugees fleeing persecution to immigrants entering Israel under the law of return that granted automatic citizenship to any Jew reaching Israeli territory. But not every extraction went smoothly. In March 1982, barely months into the operation, disaster nearly destroyed everything they had built. A routine extraction was underway, refugees loaded into Zodiacs and moving toward the rendezvous point with an Israeli Navy vessel. Unknown to the Mossad team, a Sudanese army unit had been tracking unusual activity near the coast and had positioned itself for observation. As the last Zodiac prepared to launch, headlights illuminated the beach. Soldiers emerged from trucks, weapons raised, shouting commands in Arabic for everyone to freeze and raise their hands. The Mossad operatives faced a split-second decision that would determine whether the entire operation collapsed or survived. Gad Shimron, leading the extraction team that night, made a calculation born from equal parts desperation and tactical assessment. The soldiers were approximately 200 meters away, advancing, but not yet in effective firing range. Most of the refugees were already in boats moving toward open water. Only one Zodiac remained on the beach, with approximately 15 people still boarding. Engaging the soldiers would create a firefight that would wake the entire region and guarantee immediate investigation. Surrendering would expose the operation and result in executions. The only viable option was escape, but that meant abandoning equipment and potentially leaving evidence that could be traced back to the resort. Shimron made the call: launch immediately, leave everything else. The Zodiac's engine roared to life as bullets began impacting the water around them. The soldiers had opened fire, but shooting accurately at moving targets on water in darkness is exponentially more difficult than on land. The boat accelerated, bouncing violently across waves as tracer rounds arced overhead. Refugees pressed themselves flat against the inflatable floor, while operatives returned suppressing fire, not aiming to hit, but to force the soldiers into defensive positions that would slow their advance. The gamble worked. Within minutes, the Zodiac had cleared effective range and was racing toward the Navy vessel, waiting in international waters. Behind them, the beach was chaos. Soldiers searched the area, discovering dive equipment, empty water containers, and tire tracks leading back toward the interior. The incident forced immediate operational adjustments. Naval extractions were too exposed, too dependent on variables beyond their control. If Sudanese forces had intensified coastal surveillance, future operations would face even greater risk. Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv made a decision that seemed almost insane in its audacity. They would shift from sea to air, flying transport planes directly into Sudan to extract refugees from makeshift airstrips carved out of desert. This meant violating Sudanese airspace repeatedly, landing aircraft in hostile territory, and coordinating logistics that required refugees to be transported even further inland to locations where planes could safely land and take off. The operational complexity increased exponentially, but the security advantages were compelling. Aircraft could load refugees faster, carry more people per operation, and extract from locations where Sudanese forces couldn't respond quickly enough to intercept. Shimron returned to Israel for specialized training in coordinating airlifts under hostile conditions. He studied flight patterns, learned to identify suitable landing zones from aerial reconnaissance photos, and worked with Israeli Air Force pilots to understand the technical requirements for desert strip operations. The planes selected were Hercules C-130 transports, massive aircraft capable of landing on unprepared surfaces and carrying over 90 passengers in configurations designed for military operations. The challenge was finding locations in Sudan where these planes could land without being detected by radar installations or observed by local populations who would report unusual aircraft activity to authorities. Reconnaissance identified several potential sites near Gedaref, a region northeast of Khartoum, where refugee camps were concentrated. The locations were remote desert stretches with relatively flat terrain and minimal vegetation that could obstruct landings. They weren't airstrips in any conventional sense, just expanses of hard-packed sand and rock that pilots would need to navigate using portable lights positioned by ground teams. The operations required bringing refugees from camps to these landing zones, a journey of several hours by truck through checkpoints where any inspection could expose the entire mission. The Mossad team developed elaborate cover stories. They were humanitarian workers transporting supplies, merchants moving goods to Port Sudan, contractors servicing remote installations. Each story was supported by documentation, detailed enough to withstand casual scrutiny, but not deep investigation. The first airlift took place in late 1982, under conditions that tested every assumption built into the operation's planning. Refugees were assembled at a camp near Gedaref and moved to the landing zone in waves, timed to minimize exposure. The trucks arrived after dark, unloading their passengers into the freezing desert night. Operatives positioned battery-powered lights in patterns that would guide the incoming aircraft while remaining invisible to anyone observing from distance. The refugees, many of whom had never seen an airplane up close, were instructed to remain absolutely silent and motionless until the plane landed. The psychological pressure of waiting in darkness while listening for the sound of approaching engines stretched nerves to breaking points. The Hercules appeared without warning, descending from altitude with engines throttled to minimum noise. It touched down on the improvised strip, sending up clouds of dust that obscured everything for precious seconds. The rear cargo ramp lowered immediately, and operatives began loading refugees with practiced efficiency. Families were kept together when possible, but speed took priority over comfort. 96 people boarded in under 8 minutes, cramming into the cargo bay on benches designed for paratroopers. The aircraft didn't stop moving. As soon as the last refugee was aboard, the pilot advanced throttle, and the plane began its takeoff roll while the cargo ramp was still closing. Within seconds, it was climbing steeply, banking away from Sudanese airspace toward international territory where Israeli fighters provided escort for the final leg to Tel Aviv. Back at Arouse village, the resort continued operating as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Guests arrived for their scheduled diving excursions, unaware that the friendly German instructor preparing their equipment had spent the previous night coordinating refugee extractions 200 miles inland. Egyptian army officers on leave checked in for weekend relaxation, never suspecting that their hosts were Israeli intelligence operatives running one of the most sensitive operations in Mossad history. Even British SAS soldiers vacationing at the resort failed to detect anything unusual, later expressing embarrassment when the truth eventually surfaced. The deception worked because it was total. The operatives didn't pretend to run a resort while secretly conducting espionage. They genuinely ran a functioning business that generated real revenue and provided authentic services, while simultaneously executing a parallel mission invisible to everyone around them. The financial aspects of the operation became unexpectedly important. Mossad accountants in Tel Aviv had budgeted for the resort to require continuous funding from headquarters, expecting it to operate at a loss that would be subsidized as a necessary operational expense. Instead, Arouse village became profitable. Revenue from European tourists, Egyptian military groups, and diplomatic visitors exceeded operating costs, allowing the resort to sustain itself financially while generating income that was reinvested into purchasing additional trucks, equipment, and supplies needed for refugee operations. This financial independence strengthened the operation's cover. A business that consistently lost money might attract scrutiny from Sudanese tax authorities or intelligence services suspicious of foreign fronts. A profitable enterprise operating transparently attracted no such attention. Local employees remained completely unaware of their employers' true identities. They saw European managers who paid fair wages, maintained professional standards, and treated staff with respect, uncommon in Sudan's often exploitative tourism industry. Some employees later recalled thinking their bosses were unusually fit and alert for typical resort managers, occasionally noticing that certain staff members disappeared for days without explanation. But these observations never coalesced into suspicion of intelligence operations. The compartmentalization was perfect. Sudanese workers interacted only with the resort's public functions, never accessing secure areas or observing activities that occurred during late-night hours when they were off-duty. The double life created psychological pressures that few outside intelligence work could comprehend. Operatives lived for years under identities that became as real as their birth names. They celebrated holidays with resort guests while mentally calculating extraction schedules. They socialized with Sudanese officials who would order their executions if the truth emerged. They formed friendships with local employees who trusted them completely, while concealing activities that could endanger everyone around them. The cognitive dissonance was constant and exhausting. One operative later described the experience as living inside a performance where forgetting your lines even once meant death for dozens of people who depended on your flawless execution of a role you could never acknowledge playing. The relationship between the operatives and the refugees they rescued developed into something profound and unexpected. During transport operations, the Mossad agents witnessed suffering that transcended anything their training had prepared them for. Children with distended bellies from malnutrition, adults with infected wounds that had festered for weeks without medical treatment, families who had walked hundreds of miles only to watch relatives die within sight of salvation. The operatives were intelligence professionals trained to maintain emotional distance, but the human reality of what they were witnessing eroded those barriers. They learned names, memorized faces, and carried photographs of children they had personally loaded onto aircraft, tracking their progress through resettlement programs in Israel months and years after the extractions. Between 1982 and 1984, the operation expanded beyond anything originally envisioned. What began as a plan to rescue hundreds evolved into an infrastructure capable of moving thousands. The airlift operations became increasingly sophisticated, with multiple Hercules transports landing in succession at desert strips marked only by portable lights. On certain nights, 3 aircraft would arrive within hours of each other, loading refugees in coordinated waves that maximized efficiency while minimizing ground exposure. Each plane carried between 90 and 120 people, far exceeding normal passenger capacity. Seats were removed to accommodate standing room configurations. The refugees were packed so tightly that movement was impossible, but no one complained. They had survived journeys that killed thousands. A few hours of discomfort before reaching Israel seemed like nothing. The logistics of coordinating these mass evacuations required infrastructure that extended far beyond the resort itself. Safe houses were established in Khartoum and Gedaref, where refugees could be temporarily sheltered while waiting for transport to airstrip locations. Local contacts, primarily Sudanese citizens motivated by financial compensation or humanitarian principles, provided intelligence on military movements and checkpoint patterns. These informants risked execution if discovered, but their contributions were essential. They reported when army patrols increased in certain areas, when officials were investigating unusual activity, and when conditions were optimal for conducting operations. The network operated on principles of compartmentalization. Each contact knew only their immediate role, never the broader structure or ultimate purpose. Medical emergencies posed constant challenges. Refugees arrived at collection points, suffering from dehydration, dysentery, infected wounds, and diseases that required immediate treatment to prevent deaths during transport. The Mossad operatives included several with combat medical training, but their capabilities were limited by the need to maintain cover. Bringing seriously ill refugees directly to the resort would expose the operation, yet leaving them to die contradicted the entire mission's moral foundation. Compromises were found through local clinics, operated by international humanitarian organizations. Operatives developed relationships with doctors working for these organizations, never revealing their true identities, but arranging for critical cases to receive treatment through channels that appeared routine and unconnected to the secret extractions occurring simultaneously. The financial networks supporting the operation were as complex as the physical logistics. Moving thousands of refugees required trucks, fuel, food, water, medical supplies, and payments to local contacts who provided intelligence and assistance. The resort's revenue covered much of this, but additional funding flowed through channels designed to obscure their origin. Israeli banks transferred money to Swiss accounts controlled by the front companies ostensibly operating a Rus village. These funds were then converted to Sudanese pounds through currency exchanges in Khartoum, appearing as legitimate business expenses for a functioning tourist operation. Mossad accountants maintained meticulous records that would withstand audit by Sudanese tax authorities, while concealing the true purpose of expenditures buried within operational budgets. Then came the moment every covert operation fears: exposure through compromise that originates from within your own government. In late 1984, during a period when the operation was functioning at peak efficiency, an Israeli politician made a catastrophic error. Speaking at a public event, he referenced the ongoing rescue of Ethiopian Jews from Sudan, describing it as one of Israel's greatest humanitarian achievements. The comment was made casually, intended as patriotic rhetoric to impress an audience. What the politician either didn't know or didn't consider was that the operation was still active, with dozens of Mossad operatives still operating inside Sudan, undercover identities that depended on absolute secrecy. His public acknowledgement transformed operational security from intact to shattered in the time it took for his words to reach international media. Within 24 hours, news organizations across the Arab world were reporting Israel's violation of Sudanese sovereignty. Headlines screamed about Zionist infiltration and intelligence operations on Arab soil. Diplomatic channels erupted with demands for investigations and arrests. The Sudanese government, publicly humiliated by revelations that Israeli agents had been operating a resort on their territory for years, faced domestic pressure to respond decisively. Military intelligence units were activated to locate and apprehend anyone connected to the exposed operation. The manhunt was immediate and intense. Authorities compiled lists of foreign nationals operating businesses near the Red Sea coast. Interrogations began of local employees who worked at tourist facilities. The window for escape was measured in hours, not days. Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv transmitted emergency extraction orders to all operatives in Sudan. The message was unambiguous: abandon everything and evacuate immediately. The operatives at Arouse village faced a surreal final night. European tourists were sleeping in their bungalows, unaware that the staff preparing to serve them breakfast would be gone by morning. The Israelis moved through the resort in darkness, gathering only essential documents and equipment. Everything else, the infrastructure built over years, the cover identities maintained flawlessly, the relationships cultivated carefully, had to be abandoned. They departed in vehicles headed for the desert, where a Hercules transport waited at a predetermined extraction site. The plane landed without lights, loaded the operatives in under 5 minutes, and departed while Sudanese radar operators were still trying to identify the unscheduled aircraft. Other Mossad operatives trapped in Khartoum faced even more desperate circumstances. With airports under surveillance and roads blocked by military checkpoints searching for Israelis, traditional extraction routes were impossible. The solution deployed was unprecedented in its audacity and desperation. Israeli diplomats arranged for the operatives to be concealed inside diplomatic cargo crates, officially designated as mail pouches. These containers, protected by international conventions governing diplomatic immunity, were loaded onto flights leaving Khartoum for European destinations. Inside, the operatives remained cramped and silent for hours, breathing through ventilation holes drilled into the crates, gambling that customs officials wouldn't violate diplomatic protocols by inspecting the contents. The gamble succeeded. All operatives escaped Sudan alive, but the operation that had functioned perfectly for years was finished. The tourists who woke up that morning at Arus village found the resort abandoned. The European managers, diving instructors, and senior staff had vanished overnight. Notes were left, promising refunds for interrupted vacations, a gesture that became darkly comedic when the full story emerged. Sudanese authorities arrived within hours, sealing the property and beginning forensic investigation of a facility they now understood had been an intelligence operation concealed as a business. They found evidence of hidden radio equipment, modified storage areas, and vehicle maintenance logs showing unusual travel patterns. But they found no operatives. Everyone connected to the mission had escaped, leaving behind only the physical infrastructure and the lingering question of how Israeli intelligence had operated undetected for so long in the heart of hostile territory. The numbers tell their own story of success, measured against impossible odds. Between 1982 and 1984, Operation Brothers rescued over 6,000 Ethiopian Jews from Sudan, transporting them to Israel, where they received citizenship under the law of return. This represented the majority of Beta Israel refugees who had survived the journey from Ethiopia to Sudanese camps. The operation prevented what would likely have been thousands of additional deaths from disease, starvation, and violence in camps where mortality rates remained devastatingly high. The rescue was executed without losing a single refugee during extraction operations, a statistical achievement that speaks to the professionalism and dedication of the operatives, who coordinated every detail. The exposure of Operation Brothers had immediate diplomatic consequences. Sudan's government faced intense criticism from Arab League nations for allowing Israeli operatives to establish infrastructure on their territory. Officials claimed they had been deceived by sophisticated forgeries and false identities, which was true but provided little comfort to populations outraged by the perceived security failure. The incident strained Sudan's relationships with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, both of which viewed the revelations as evidence of incompetence that could threaten regional security. Internally, Sudanese intelligence services underwent restructuring, as officers were dismissed for failing to detect foreign operations under their jurisdiction. In Israel, the operation's success was celebrated, even as the political leadership faced criticism for the leak that ended it prematurely. Mossad professionals privately expressed fury at the politician, whose careless words had compromised operatives still in the field and terminated an operation that could have continued extracting refugees for months or years longer. The incident reinforced within intelligence circles the absolute necessity of operational security and the devastating consequences when political figures prioritize public relations over classified missions. Investigations were launched to determine how such sensitive information had reached someone outside operational channels, leading to reforms in how intelligence briefings were conducted with elected officials. The rescued refugees faced their own challenges upon arrival in Israel. Many spoke no Hebrew and possessed no education beyond basic literacy. They came from agricultural communities in Ethiopia, where life revolved around subsistence farming and traditional religious practices. Suddenly, they found themselves in a modern, industrialized nation, where everything from language to technology to social customs was alien. Integration programs were established to provide Hebrew instruction, job training, and cultural orientation. But the transition remained difficult, marked by discrimination from some segments of Israeli society, who questioned whether Ethiopian Jews were authentically Jewish and deserved equal status. These prejudices created barriers to employment, housing, and social acceptance that the refugees had to overcome, while processing the trauma of everything they had survived to reach safety. The operatives who had run Arouse village returned to lives that could never fully acknowledge what they had accomplished. Their work remained classified for years, discussed only in closed intelligence circles, where operations were analyzed for lessons learned. They carried memories of refugees whose lives they had saved, faces they would never forget, and the knowledge that their deception had served a purpose beyond espionage. Some struggled with the psychological aftermath of living undercover for years, finding it difficult to maintain authentic relationships when they had spent so long performing false identities. Others found meaning in knowing that their work had resulted in tangible good, that intelligence skills typically associated with violence and deception had been employed to rescue rather than destroy. Operation Brothers became the precursor to subsequent rescue missions that continued bringing Ethiopian Jews to Israel over the following decades. In May 1991, as Ethiopia's government collapsed amid civil war, Israel launched Operation Solomon, an even more dramatic airlift that transported over 14,000 Ethiopian Jews in 36 hours using a fleet of El Al passenger aircraft. One flight carried 1,067 passengers, setting a world record by removing seats and packing the plane beyond any normal capacity. The success of these later operations was built on experience gained during Operation Brothers, demonstrating how intelligence infrastructure developed for one mission could inform strategies for future humanitarian interventions. The legacy of Arouse village extends beyond the numbers rescued or the operational innovations it represented. The mission revealed something fundamental about intelligence work that contradicts popular mythology. The most successful covert operations aren't the ones involving dramatic violence or spectacular sabotage. They're the ones built on patience, discipline, and the ability to maintain mundane normalcy while conducting extraordinary activities beneath that surface. The Mossad operatives who ran a diving resort for years demonstrated mastery of deception, not through elaborate disguises or action movie heroics, but through the painstaking work of actually becoming competent resort managers who happen to have a secret purpose. The psychological profiles required for such operations are rare. Intelligence services can train operatives in languages, weapons, and surveillance techniques relatively quickly, What cannot be easily taught is the temperament required to live for years inside a cover identity, maintaining performance discipline every single day without the adrenaline rush of immediate danger to sharpen focus. The operatives at Arouse Village couldn't afford mistakes. Every interaction with guests, every conversation with local employees, every transaction with Sudanese officials had to align perfectly with their false identities. A single inconsistency, one moment of carelessness, could trigger suspicions that would unravel the entire operation and result in executions for everyone involved. The resort itself stood empty for years after the operation's exposure, before eventually being repurposed by new owners, who tried to revive it as a legitimate tourism destination. But the property carried stigma. Sudanese citizens remembered it as the site of Israeli infiltration. Potential investors worried about security implications. The diving operations that had provided such perfect cover never fully recovered. The pristine beaches and clear waters remained, but the business model had been permanently tainted by revelations of its previous use. Today, fragments of the original infrastructure still exist, physical remnants of an operation that seemed impossible even after it succeeded. For the Ethiopian Jewish community in Israel, the rescue operations became foundational narratives of survival and rebirth. Families tell stories of the journey through Sudan, the terrifying nights hiding in storage rooms at the resort, the moment they first saw the Israeli coastline from the deck of a Navy vessel. These memories are passed to children and grandchildren as testament to the lengths Israel went to fulfill its promise of providing refuge for Jews in danger. The community built synagogues, established neighborhoods, and created cultural organizations that preserved Ethiopian Jewish traditions while adapting to Israeli society. The operation also exposed vulnerabilities that remain relevant decades later. The political leak that terminated Brothers demonstrated how easily operational security can be compromised by officials outside the intelligence community who lack understanding of how covert missions function. The incident led to reforms in how sensitive information is shared with elected leaders, establishing protocols that restrict operational details to those with genuine need to know. These reforms couldn't prevent all future leaks, but they created institutional awareness that careless words can have lethal consequences for operatives in the field. What remains most striking about Operation Brothers is the gap between its audacity and its execution. Proposing that Israeli intelligence could operate a resort inside an enemy nation for years while extracting thousands of refugees sounds like fiction too implausible for serious consideration. Yet it happened, executed with professionalism that kept the operation secret until political incompetence exposed it. The success wasn't luck or coincidence. It resulted from meticulous planning, rigorous training, and the discipline to maintain cover under conditions where a single mistake meant death. The final toll of Operation Brothers can't be measured only in the 6,000 lives directly saved. It includes the children and grandchildren of those refugees, the continuation of families that would have ended in Sudanese camps, the contributions those individuals made to Israeli society, and the preservation of cultural traditions that enriched the broader Jewish world. The operation demonstrated that intelligence services, institutions typically associated with violence and deception, could employ those same skills toward purposes that were unambiguously moral. The operatives who ran Arouse Village earned no public recognition during their lives. Their work remained classified, their identities protected, their sacrifices unacknowledged by the people they saved. But they knew what they had accomplished, and in the quiet spaces where intelligence professionals gather away from public scrutiny, Operation Brothers is remembered as proof that espionage can serve purposes beyond national interests. That sometimes the invisible machinery of state power is employed not to destroy enemies, but to rescue the vulnerable. That the greatest intelligence operations are the ones that save lives rather than ending them. The desert road where this story began still exists. Trucks still break down in the heat. But the refugees who once traveled that route are grandparents now, telling stories to children born in safety about the journey through darkness and the strange resort by the sea where their lives were saved by people whose real names they never learned. That's the legacy of Operation Brothers. Not monuments or medals, but living proof that sometimes, against all probability and reason, the impossible becomes real through the will of people who refuse to accept that certain lives can't be saved.